And we are, I think we are about to be live. As soon as we are, I'm going to mute people. Right, yes, we are live. Okay, good. We go back to here. Who do we need to mute? Got noise in the background from someone.
It's me.
You?
Yeah.
All right, we'll just mute you for the moment. There you go, right. Okay. So we are doing the 19th century. So you are muted, but you are all allowed to unmute yourselves if you want to, as we are going along. So if you need to ask a question or interfere, clarify a point, object, anyone, with the exception of the known troublemakers, are allowed to ask a question during that point there. So 19th century. In the last couple of weeks, once we hit the 1600s onwards, we've had to from the 1500s, from the beginning of the 16th century, we've had to devote 2 lectures a week per century. If we manage to do this century in 2 weeks, we're doing very well, and I think it might stretch us into a 3rd century. I'm going to go back for a little bit because we're going to hit a little bit of the Americas, and in order to do that, we've got to go back to the 18th century, the 1700s. And bearing in mind that this was something I was discussing with Nachia last night, with the inauguration of President Biden tomorrow, with some of the scenes we saw at the Capitol building last week, and the anti-Semitic T-shirts that were being worn at that time. And in fact, with a lot of what's taken place in the last couple of years and the anti-Semitism in America, it's worth our while remembering that when America was founded, when the United States of America as a continent has been there, and it wasn't discovered by Christopher Columbus. It was always there. It was just the New World was being discovered by the Europeans. It had been there long beforehand, and there had been people living there. When they established themselves as a state and began the original 13 colonies, the Christians that came there were just as much interlopers and migrants as the Jews were at the beginning. And we will see in 1776 onwards the impact that makes, and the slight arguments as to whether or not Jews had equal rights in America as Christians. It was a country founded as a religious country. In God we trust, in God we believe, but for many this still excluded the Jews. I want to go back to 1733. In 1733 we have a man by the name of Shmuel Nunes, although his original name was Diego Nunes Ribeiro, who, yes, Chai, you recognize that name, very good, who has had to flee from Portugal. It's quite a fascinating story. As some put it, it's only of biblical proportions. He was the physician, obviously, to the royal court in Portugal. He was, like many of the Moranos, he was a secret Jew, and he took one chance too many in helping out Jews in Portugal. The Inquisition was still very much alive and well in the mid-18th century. He gets caught. Together with his entire family, they get taken by the Inquisition, and they start getting tortured terribly. Together with his wife was called Zipporah. Unfortunately, or fortunately to them, the Grand Inquisitor was suddenly afflicted with a crucifying pain. And yes, I'll use that word, crucifying pain. He had an obstructed bladder. And the only ones at that point who were proficient in urology were, of course, the Jews. And the only doctor able to help out the Grand Inquisitor was sitting in their dungeons being tortured. The torturer was being tortured, and the only one that could help him and save him was one of the guys he was torturing. So obviously self-preservation prevailed, and Diego Nunes, together with his family, were released from prison but put under house arrest. He cured the Inquisitor with his knowledge of urology, and he was put under house arrest, and there were soldiers from the Holy Office were there at all times to make sure that they do not escape. In 1726, they did something a story which is repeated a number of times. They go on to, they have a party. They have a number of such parties in those days on barges on the river or on ships that are on the river, which are quite ocean-going ships. And whilst everybody's having lots of wine, together with the officers from the soldiers from the Holy Office, nobody noticed that the ship raises anchor and it sails away from Portugal. And by the time they realize what's happening, they wake up the next morning, having imbibed a little bit too much of the wine, they realize that they're outside of Portuguese national waters. There's nothing they can do about it. They arrive in England. Diego's now has changed his name to Samuel, and he arrives in England and he joins Bevis Marks Schule. So we looked at the founding of Bevis Marks Schule 2 weeks ago in the beginning of the 18th century in 1700, and they're living in England until 1733. And this is important for us, when they go together with 42 other Jews on the William and Sarah, they go out to America. So before 1776, this is before the establishment of even the first 13 colonies, before the Declaration of Independence, well before the Civil War between the North and the South, between the Confederates and those in the North, already Jews of the Civil War.
Which one was that?
Later on, we'll get to that later on, Abraham. We've already got Jews living in America, as we'll see later on. At one point, they tried to establish a promised land along the Mississippi River. And at one point up north in Buffalo, in upstate New York, to have a autonomous Jewish state. It's not long later on that you get the Pale of Jewish settlement in Western Russia, having the same sort of thing. But they go out to America, 42 Jews, all bar 8 of them are Sephardim. The first shuls in America that are set up are Sephardic shuls, and a number of them are still around today. Unfortunately, when they get to Savannah, Georgia, they did not want to have so many Jews turn up there. And we seem to have a repeat of the story that had the same thing that had saved Shmuel or Diego Nunes in Portugal, now saves him in Savannah, Georgia, because when they get there, there is an outbreak of smallpox. And Shmuel Nunes knows how to fight against smallpox. He's got a vaccine for it. By the way, we're going to be coming to another epidemic later on, which we'll get in in Europe. But he brings with them, and the only person that had been able to stop the fever was James Cox, who was the physician. And of course, he dies in the outbreak of, yellow fever, not smallpox, yellow fever. I do apologize. They didn't yet have the vaccine for it. Sorry, David. There's too many vaccines flying around at the moment. It was yellow fever. He brings it along with them. They allow Nunes to go off. He'd had a lot of experience, as did a lot of the Sephardi Jews who'd gone off to Brazil, West Africa, and the Caribbean. They knew what malaria was, whether or not they understood how it was transmitted. And the doctors will debate that as to when they figured it out. But he's able to go along and he sets up shop in Savannah, Georgia, once again, because of his medicine there. They set up the first shul called Mikveh Yisrael. We've got a picture of it. I'm sure many of you would have actually seen Mikveh Yisrael. Let's make sure we get the right one up, because there are that many of them, and not the tourist synagogue. Mikveh Yisrael. And we'll share it on the screen so you can see it. There's been a lot of them. It was just plain old Wikipedia in order for us to see Mikveh Yisrael. This is over here. And as you'll see, the leadership, its affiliation, it is now Reform Judaism. But it was initially set up by Sephardic Jews. David, I hope you don't mind if we turn around and say that it didn't really change much if it went from Sephardic to Reform. That's being recorded. I should not. How dare I say that? What a disgrace. But this shul was originally set up there. It's interesting, a lot of those shuls, the Sephardic ones, were taken over by Reform because they were the ones that had the money later on in order to be able to deal with it. But it's set up in 1735. We see here we've got the 42 Jews that came from London on the William and Sarah, arrived there July the 11th, 1733. So we speak about Jews being in England, being in America. They are there well before the establishment of the United States of America. It's named Mikveh Yisrael after Menashe ben Israel, who had, of course, got the Jews back into England a century earlier, well, nearly 2 centuries earlier on at the time of Oliver Cromwell. But it's his grandson his great-grandson who I really want to look at, who is in our century. I said we had to go back a little bit to the 18th century in order to get a little bit more of our century here and to find out some fascinating facts. Before we do that, though, we have in 1819, they wanted to set up Jewish territory in Missouri and Mississippi. This was an official move to set up a state for the Jews. And the W.D. Robinson, he writes in his memoir that we should, with benevolent help and investment, we should behold Jewish agriculture spreading through the American forests, Jewish towns and villages bordering the banks of the Missouri and the Mississippi. He says the Jews are agricultural. They know about it. Now, whilst the Americans, when they're pushing further west the whole time, they all want to have their homestead. They want to be able to say that the Jews were mainly peddlers. But whilst we've seen as peddlers, what he's pointing out, he says, if you open up the Bible, they were agricultural. When we settled in the land of Israel, they were very much agricultural, and they should be able to be setting up over here. And we'll cross over to Thomas Jefferson and his love of what took place with agriculture and how that impacted with another Jew. But they want to set up an autonomous state for them. Later on, there is a man by the name of Mordechai, who was very much a political agitator. He becomes the mayor of New York at one point, but he loses his bid to be elected a second time because of anti-Semitism. But he bought 17,000 acres of prime land on Grand Island in the Niagara River near Buffalo in upstate New York. And this would be a place of repose for Israel and Judah within the United States. He believed that at one point we were going to unite together with the Great Lake Indians, whom Mordechai believed were the descendants of the 10 lost tribes, and we would be smoking the peace pipes together with the Indians. So the Jews who had come over from Europe, and mainly England, as had been quickly running out, or England and the westernmost areas of Europe where they'd escaped from Spain and Portugal, then turn up in America in the 1700s. And now in the beginning of the 1800s, they envisaged for themselves an actual autonomous state within the states of America, where they would join together with the indigenous population who were the Native Americans. They would smoke the peace pipes because they were all brothers together, bearing in mind that at this point, the Jews in Europe, in the Western world, forgot, David said he's just been along by the rivers of Babylon, very much forgot about their other Jewish family, those that were living in the Muslim lands. And it wasn't until later on in the century when all of a sudden they realized that they were really all one family. But they'd pretty much forgotten about even the Sephardim would come over from Spain and Portugal, forgot about the other Sephardim. There was a major break in the European Sephardim and the Middle Eastern Sephardim. But here they want to set up 17,000 acres. By 1824, he'd persuaded enough philanthropic enthusiasts to buy only 2,500 acres for £10,000, $10,000. And on the 15th of September, 1825, he sets up this autonomous state. He calls it Ararat. And Mordechai Noah is the founding father of this. He wants to set up a Grand Sanhedrin, of 70 elders. Unfortunately, he's got nowhere to make his opening speech. He borrows a costume of Richard III from the local theatrical troupe, and he stands in the evangelical church of St. Paul's in Buffalo, and he sets up his edicts for the Jews. It doesn't actually bode well when they wanted to set up a state for the Jews. You dress up looking like Richard III from the local theatrical troupe, and you stand it in the evangelical church telling the Jews how they have to do. They were all going to, every Jew around the world was going to have to pay a Jew tax of 4 shekel, not dollars, but 4 shekel. And he sets up a number of rules. One of them is that polygamy is forbidden. Well, polygamy had been forbidden in Ashkenazi Jews and for already over 800 Jews. Ararat was a seed. There is no harvest whatsoever. The Jewish immigrants who come along prefer New York, Philadelphia, and Cincinnati rather than going to Grand Island. And that falls by the wayside, and there never is a Jewish autonomous state. Although the idea does come up again in the time of Herzl later on in the century, which we're not going to get to this week. But we've mentioned this guy, Shmuel Nunes, or Diego Nunes. It's his great-grandson that I want to have a look at for a moment, a guy by the name of Uriah Levy. Uriah Levy is married to the daughter of Rachel Phillips Levy, who is the great-granddaughter of Shmuel Nunes. She has 21 children, by the way. All bar 4 of them live past infancy. So 17 children survived past infancy, which in the 1800s was phenomenal. It's totally crazy to do that. And her son is a guy by the name of Uriah Levy. Uriah Levy is a bit of a, is an anomaly. At the age of 10, he runs away to join the Navy, although he told the captain of the merchant ship that he would have to come back in 2 years to enable him to celebrate his bar mitzvah. He becomes a lieutenant in the Navy. He gets court-martialed 6 times for insubordination, but some of that, a lot of that, is because he can't understand the Navy way from a Christian perspective. He sees the flogging of the seamen as being terrible, and he instead says, let's just embarrass them. Let's not rip their back to shreds. Of course, for the hardy seamen, to be embarrassed morally was a far worse punishment than to be flogged physically. So he was up against it. At one point, his court-martial was overturned by the president at that point. I forget the name of which president it was, but he really pushes forward and he becomes a cause celebre. I've forgotten, let's get a picture of Uriah Levy. Sorry, I should have put it up on the screen. That is Uriah Levy. I will try, I'll put it up on the screen later on. I'll get you a better picture of it to put up on the screen. But Uriah Levy is fascinating because he bought a house called Monticello. Who had previously owned Monticello? Monticello. There's an estate called Monticello, a very famous estate. Come on, Ian, you should know who had owned Monticello before Thomas Jefferson bought it. Anyone going to hazard a guess who owned Monticello?
George Washington.
A little bit later.
The next one.
Jackson.
Yeah, no. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson owned Monticello. It was a massive estate. And he has in it his Indian room. He has in it, he was a planter. He was also had his library. Thomas Jefferson donates it, becomes the start of the Library of Congress. But Uriah Levy buys this for, there's an argument, at one place I found $2,500, another place I found $3,000. It was a fortune, although within 10 years of Jefferson passing away, the estate owed $174,000 in debt. And for a Jew to buy it was considered to be sacrilege, but it had fallen to rack and ruin. And bit by bit, Uriah Levy rebuilds Monticello. And he wants to champion Jefferson. And he writes at one point in November 1832, he writes to the Philadelphia shipbuilder, John Coulter, who he'd worked for. He says, I consider Thomas Jefferson to be one of the greatest men in the history, the author of the Declaration of Independence and an absolute Democrat. He serves as an inspiration to millions of Americans. He did much to mold our republic. By the way, at this point, everyone in the northern states were called Democratic Republicans. There wasn't yet the Democrats and the Republicans. They were called Democratic Republicans because they set up a republic, but they were democratic. So the two were one. Later on, they split. Once you, after the Civil War, you then have the two-state party, the Democrats and the Republicans. But at that point, they were Democratic Republicans. He did much to mold our republic in a form in which a man's religion does not make him ineligible for political or governmental life. And this was a big push in the beginning of the 19th century. Can a Jew be an officer in the army or the navy? Can a Jew hold a government official? Can a Jew stand to be president? It's not long since Benjamin Disraeli had stood and had become Prime Minister of England. Okay, he'd had to officially apostatize, but in America, which was a land of no religion for anyone, enabling everybody to have their own religion, surely this should be the way here. He was a noble man, yet there is no statue to him in the Capitol in Washington. As a small payment for his determined stand on the side of religious liberty, I am preparing to personally commission a statue of Jefferson. And the statue of Jefferson, I'll bring up the picture here of the statue of Jefferson. And for this one, we went through here he is here. Let's get there's a statue there. We'll just share it on the screen with you. That there was a gift. That's a statue of Jefferson. And it's officially, his quill is very much pointing towards the Declaration of Independence. It was only officially, formally accepted by Congress in 1874. Until that time when he gave it to them. 30 years earlier, it was sort of rebuffed. How dare a Jew suppose that he could give it to us? He presented to Congress in March in 1834. So it was 40 years earlier, sorry. And it was very awkward. Should it or shouldn't it be done? They couched it in the sense of how dare an individual, although it was really a Jewish individual, how Uriah Levy, is very much Jewish. It starts off, let's go earlier on over here. By the way, that's Uriah Phillips Levy. That is the picture I showed earlier on. That is a better one of him for you to see there. It was intended to be placed in the Capitol Rotunda. It gets put in front of the White House. Here you can see just in the front of that. It's made of bronze in order so that it should, as time goes by, actually show the weathering of it. He didn't want it to be in marble because that would seem to be too cold. They said to me, it's a chutzpah, it is going to age. He says, yes, it needs to show the passage of time, and he donates it. Eventually, it was put in the city council chamber later on, but he wanted to actually give it and put it there. At one point, it was rebuffed, but that is the statue that he puts up there. So that is just a little bit of life in America in the beginning of the 19th century, but we're going to leave them alone and we're going to go back to Europe. Just before I do, there is one further picture I just want to show you of, here is his mother, a picture done of his mother. Where is it? There we go. This is a portrait of Rachel McAdder Phillips Levy, printed in 1795. That is it doesn't look very, very Sephardi or Portuguese, but that is Uriah Levy's mother. What's interesting is this was a marriage between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. She was Sephardi, her husband was Ashkenazi, and he, agreed to be able to do all this over here. So that is just America for the moment, but we've only got 1 hour, and I want to jump across. Sorry, there was one more area which I find fascinating. you might remember Chief Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory said that this country started on its downward spiral. At what point? There was one bit of legislation that was brought into England that Chief Rabbi Sachs really rallied against. And years later, Prince Charles said he was correct. Does anybody know which bit of legislation I'm speaking about?
No.
Okay. Anyone?
It's higher there.
Chai's there, she's thinking.
We're all thinking.
Okay. Sunday trading, to allow shops to be open on the Sabbath. On the Sunday trading, Rabbi Sachs railed it. He said that was the beginning of the, when consumerism really takes over everything. In America, in 1855, the Santa Cruz lemon grower, William W. Stowe, becomes the Speaker of the California Assembly. So we don't yet have the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's the Speaker of the California Assembly. And they wanted to stop Sunday closing. And there was one Jewish trader, Louis Schwartz, who he refused to join the petition for Sunday closing. He wanted to make it into California law. And he stands up in court, in the California Assembly, and he says, I have no sympathy with the Jews, and were it in my power to enforce a regulation that would eliminate them, not only from our country, but from the entire state. He says, I want a Jew tax so high that the Jews will not be able to open up any more shops. The basis of the Republican system is the Christian Sabbath and the Christian religion. The Jews must form the majority. They are a class of people who come here only to make money, who leave the country as soon as they make money. Bearing in mind, this is the beginning of the Californian gold rush, and a lot of them have gone along. Along comes a Sephardi Jew, Henry J. Labatt, a Sephardi Jew with a Yale law degree. It's not long ago that Jews in England had been allowed to go along to universities. He was originally from Charleston, but he's an authority in California law, and he writes a response. He says, you write, he said to Mr. Speaker, you write as the head of the House of Representatives, and flagrant mistruths. You say they come to make money and leave. Are you ignorant of the number of families who arrive on every steamer to make California their home? Are you ignorant of the building of brick synagogues, i.e. to last, erected in our large cities for family worship? Are you ignorant of the permanent benevolent societies which they extend the hand of charity to everyone? If you're ignorant of the facts, then you're just ignorant. If you're not, and you've misrepresented the facts, then you're a disgrace to the house over which you have the dishonor to preside. So we have on the one hand, you've got Uriah Levy, who becomes a naval lieutenant. He buys Thomas Jefferson's house. He's the one that pays for the first statue of Thomas Jefferson. On the other, in 1834, on the other hand, you have the governor of the Speaker of the California House of Representatives wanting to kick all of the Jews out. There is obviously tension there, but as I said at the very beginning, what is often forgotten is that we were there right at the very beginning. And whilst we've discussed this earlier on with regards to Poland, Jews have been there since the 10th century. And when, as we'll get to in a couple of weeks, by the time it comes to 1939, the indigenous Jew in Poland, the indigenous Pole in Poland was the Jew. And they were the ones being told, get out of here, go along to Israel. That was 1,000 years beforehand. Here you're talking, it's the birth of the nation. And at the very beginning, the Jews were there in the 1700s. They contributed to the building of the state, to its legislation. According to many, when Thomas Jefferson writes about the freedom of religion, he was borrowing from the words of the Jews. He went along to visit them. He went with the first American president, his name, thank you very much, George Washington. They go along to a shul, and it's their wording that they incorporate to the First Amendment to allow freedom of religion for everyone. Freedom of religion does not, it seems, even then, did not include lack of anti-Semitism or for others to really view the Jews as being terrible. Let's leave the Americas alone for the moment and jump across to Europe. I said at the very beginning, David said he'd been to this lecture on the rivers of Babylon, the Jews of the Muslim lands who are forced to leave in 1948, the exodus of over 1 million Jews who are leaving the Muslim lands, who were all incorporated into the state of Israel, are not given refugee status. But we've got in 1840, 5th of December, 1840, in Damascus, we have the beheading of a Jewish girl. Sorry, just before that, this one in Fez. We've got a young girl by the name of Sol Hatchuel, who gets beheaded. The reason why she gets beheaded, she's a 17-year-old girl who has a faribble with her parents. Which 17-year-old girl doesn't have a faribble with parents? Don't you dare start a chabrach. She has a faribble with her parents. She goes along to see a friend, a Muslim friend. And this Muslim friend tells her, she says, well, come on, become Muslim. And then you'll be able to tell your parents where to go, because Jews in Fez at that moment, they are very much lower class citizens. They're not allowed to walk out during the time of certain festivals. You get murdered straight away. You know, the type of clothes they're allowed to wear, they're very much second class citizens. So she says, if you had a faribble with your parents, come join me, live with my family, and accept the one true faith. She tells a friend, stop hacking and chanting. She recognized the fact that she just had a faribble with her parents and it wasn't that important. Unfortunately, her friend, who knows how much credit you get for bringing in a Jew to the one true faith, sends a letter, and she tells her, she tells the Pasha of Tangier that a conversion has actually taken place. And Sol gets brought out. She says, no, there hasn't. And they say to her, in that case, you now are apostatizing out of Islam. The punishment of that is death. She says, I can't apostatize out of Islam because I never converted to Islam. I am still a Jewish girl, born Jewish, raised Jewish, living Jewish. They would not listen to her at all. They torture her until eventually they say she's got to be executed. But, and bear in mind, this is a 17-year-old girl. And they put it there, and the Pasha tells the executioner, before you behead her, just put your scimitar, is that how it's pronounced, scimitar? Scimitar, that one. Put it to her neck, draw blood, let her feel the pain, and hopefully she will recant. She refused. She is beheaded. Her father goes along, has to pay the Pasha in order to take his daughter's beheaded body, head and trunk, in order for it to get a Jewish burial. But it's seen as if she is, she dies al-Kiddush Hashem. Now, for some Muslims, they treat Sol with reluctant admiration, but you've got a lot of problems over here. And in fact, the French authorities running over there really don't, they blame the Jews for what's happened. If we go through, and I don't go through all of them now, oftentimes there is a portrayal of Jews having lived side by side with Muslims in peaceful harmony. And it was only the advent of modern Zionism, went from 1800s onwards, and then the terrible calamity of the establishment of the state in 1948 that brought about the faribble. I know if you speak to Jews that have been living in Cairo, they're able to say, yes, Cairo, Alexandria, Baghdad, Aleppo, it was brilliant. Those were the cosmopolitan Jews who were accepted or who were tolerated because of the finances that they brought in. By and large, Jews in Muslim countries in the 19th century, the 1800s, were worse than second-class citizens. The torture that was openly done time and time again was terrible. And at one point, we've got in the winter of 1840, 5th of February in Damascus, there is 5,000 Jews living there. And a Capuchin friar, Tommaso, together with his Muslim servant girl, goes missing. Later on, they find out that they'd been seen walking out of town, nothing to do with it. He was reported, though, to have been seen last in the Jewish quarter. And they bring up once again the blood libel, the fact that it's February. Pesach is not for another 2 months, by the by. And they one by one torture to death all of the leaders of the community, my daughters are in the room and I'm not going to tell you what it was they did to them. Hi, you're not reading the book over here. She's just looking forward to time. Really never. You're not reading the book. Absolute terrible, unthinkable torture of what they do to them. When the French council, Rati Menton, hears about it, he refers to it as an appalling affair. Not the torture, but the abduction of the monk by the Jews. So unfortunately, there is a lot of bad feeling, and it's only on the 5th of May in 1840, the Jewish Board of Deputies, who were joined together in 1776, they'd taken the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi Jews, so there's Bevis Marks and the Grand Ashkenazi Synagogue, joined together in 1776 to form the Board of Deputies. They, at the headquarters in Park Lane, London, they plan a systematic campaign to get the Jewish prisoners released. And you have the grandees of Jewish society at that point, Montefiore's, the Rothschilds, the McCarters, the Goldsmiths, etc., Cohens and Levies, I don't know who they are, but they're always in the list of all the names there, in order to really complete the emancipation of Jews. But living in Muslim countries in the 1800s, for the cosmopolitan ones who were living in the capitals and who were able, in some places, fine, Baghdad and Cairo, Aleppo, but for the majority of the hundreds of thousands, the million Jews living there, it was not a good time at all. And so we're going to leave them alone and go along to Europe. We mentioned last week the rise of Hasidism, and we also mentioned the Vilna Gaon. The main impact the two of them have together is now in Russia. We've got Tsarist Russia. And just to run through the list of the Tsars up until the Communist Revolution in 1916, we started with Tsar Alexander I, who's from 1800 to 1824. He takes over when he sees his father assassinated by the staff within the royal palace, and he has an absolute fear and distrust, thank you very much, distrust of anyone outside of his immediate family. He gets taken over by his brother, Nikolai I, who was a tyrant who ruled Tsarist Russia for 25 years, for 30 years, from 1824 until 1854. He gets taken over by Alexander II until 1881. Alexander III, he was also assassinated. Alexander III until 1894. Then the last Tsar of Russia, Nikolai II, who from 1894 until 1916, when of course he's assassinated.
17. It's 1917.
Chaya says 1917. I'm not going to argue with her. 1917 until you have the communist revolution. Yeah. But during this time, Jews in Tsarist Russia, up, down, up, down. They never know what's going to be along. One person can be, and we'll see him, he was imprisoned over the course of 16 weeks, imprisoned 22 times by the personal representative of the Tsar. And at the end of it, he gets given a piece of paper entitled Honored Citizen of Russia. So, you never know where it is you're going to be going up and down with there. So we mentioned last week the Vilna Gaon, the opposite side of the Hasidim. We need to mention his most famous Talmud, Reb Chaim Volozhin, who started the Yeshiva movement. So we looked last week and we said of the Cheder movement. Now we know of the famous yeshiva, and Ralph and I have been along to the yeshiva of Lublin, where Daf Yomi begins. Well, this whole yeshiva system is started by Reb Chaim of Volozhin, who is 1749 is born, passed away in 1821. He's a Talmud of a student of the Vilna Gaon, and sets up the yeshiva system in 1803. This system continued up until the Second World War, breaks out in 1939, although that yeshiva was closed by the Russians in January of 1892. So he sets it up in 1803. It lasts for 89 years, and it's only stopped by the Russians when they really want to interfere with organized Jewish life. And that yeshiva system then gets transported from Poland to Israel. You got the yeshiva system of Mir, or even Gateshead is a continuation of that. In Manchester, the Shari Torah Yeshiva on Upper Park Road is a continuation of it. And it's very much the pilpul pilpul from the Hebrew word of pilpel, of pepper, sharp, to really tackle a piece of Gemara, which is understandable why from them we have the Daf Yomi system growing out of it, that you've got those who are really, really delving into and who know a piece of Gemara inside out. And then you're going to say, right, fine, what about everybody else? Are they going to be able to do one daf a day? If you're in yeshiva, you do not do a double page of Gemara a day. If you're in yeshiva, you do a couple of lines a day because you go into it in real detail. There is a brilliant scene in Chaim Potok, The Chosen, I believe it is, when you've got the Hasidic Rebbe's son and the Yeshiva University professor's son, one of whom, so the Yeshiva University professor is the one who really delves in. The Rebbe's son is also an Ilay, but he knows the whole breadth of the Shas. And it's two different ways of doing it, but you've got the Yeshiva system of really going in. His son, Rabbi Yitzhak Volozhin, takes over in 1849. His son-in-law, we'll look at more next week, the Netziv, Reb Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who the most brilliant mind of that time, takes over. Born in 1817, he takes over, and he marries into the family of the Soloveitchik, Reb Yosh Geber, as he's known, Reb Yosef Dovbar Levi Soloveitchik, who passes away in 1892. But this is the whole yeshiva system we'll look at more another week. But we mentioned the Hasidim, we mentioned the Vonogona. We really must look at, we must, concentrate a little bit more another week on that whole system of how it really, and without them, all of the Jewish life that we see when we go along and we look at pre-war Europe, there's the two strands of it. There's a Hasidic strand, and there's very much the yeshiva strand. I'm not going to call them misnagdim because the word misnagid is the opposing one. The yeshiva strand is really the beauty of learning Torah and sitting there, and as we say, kvetching the bank, is squeezing the bench for a long time and having an impact on it. What do the Russians, how are they going to impact what we have in here? So there's two areas. There's one within the very essence of Jewish life. The other one is within the Cantonists. So first, the essence of Jewish life. In 1827, they begin, the Tsar, the Russian Tsars. So in 1827, we've got Nikolai I, who's taken over from his brother Alexander I, aided by the Haskalah, the Enlightenment movement, which we learned about 2 weeks ago with Moses Mendelssohn. Not that we can blame him for it, but it starts this whole era of the Haskalah movement, which really fails a lot in most of Russia. It's most successful place is in a city on the Black Sea, famous city. Anyone want to hazard a guess which city? Its most famous street was called Jew Street, and the main language spoken there was actually Yiddish. But Yiddish not because they, Alan, I couldn't hear you, but I read your lips. I think you got it right.
Odessa.
Correct. The main language being Yiddish there was the Yiddish of the theater, not the Yiddish of Meir Shorim, a different Yiddish. They were very much an enlightened one. And in the words of Simon Sharma, he quotes from somebody, he says, you had the men shaving their beards and going to Odessa with their wives and family. You have the women refusing to shave their hair and schlepping their husbands to Odessa from both of them. I think he's actually got it a little bit wrong because there is no indication of the shaving, that the women shaved their hair before the wedding as far back as the 1800s. It seems to be much, much later on, more like the 19th century, whereby it started. So he's just doing a little bit of a play of the words that the men shaved their beards, went to Odessa, the women refused to shave their hair and went to Odessa. But in the majority of Russia, the Haskalah does not survive, mainly because of the twin forces of the Hasidic movement and the Yeshiva movement. But in 1827, the Russians begin to start to say that we want to have authority here. And in 1835, they bring in new laws in order to define the role of the rabbi. One of them, he had to be fluent in Russian. By 1844, they set up the rabbinical colleges. The previous year, they had abolished the Kahal, which was a system whereby the Jewish communities ruled themselves. They set their own taxes. They were intermediaries to the authorities. They punished, they rewarded. It was the Kahal was in charge. They abolished that in 1843, and in 1844, they set up, quote unquote, rabbinical college, official seminaries, that only a graduate from there was allowed to act as a rabbi. By 1853, if you wanted to hire a rabbi in Russia, it was illegal to do so unless that person had been trained by the state. Meken Shemein, we can already understand what sort of training such a rabbi was going to get. And then in 1859, they said how secular studies had to be done as part of the yeshiva and cheder system. Now, not all of that is terrible. Mathematics, geography, Russian language, but also culture. You know, nowadays, the argument in England and America, can intelligent design, is it allowed to be taught? Can you have Chumash presented as facts? Or do we have to say that there's the Big Bang Theory and evolution? And there's a massive argument. Well, this argument goes back to what they wanted to force them to be taught in Russia in the mid-19th century of what they're going along there. Now, in order to achieve a lot of this, in 1825, they started off with the decree of the Cantonists. Now, a Cantonist is a Russian word which originally meant it was you had a family who couldn't afford to feed their children. They might have had fourth, fifth, sixth child, who knows? But they couldn't afford to feed all of their children. So what would they do? They would give their child at the age of 12, whatever, or even younger, and they would give him to a family who would look after this child, would be paid for by the state, and would eventually join the army as a soldier. If you couldn't afford to feed him, send him off to join the army. But this was done voluntarily, and the kids were looked after in order to enable so that by the time they turn 18, they are good material for the army. Unfortunately, this idea gets taken and gets abused terribly in order to take Jewish children. Now, initially, or even before it gets doubled by the Tsar, there would be one 18-year-old would have to be given up every year for every 100 Jews in Russia. Not every 100 18-year-olds, which wouldn't have been the end of the world. This was one soldier for every 100 Jews. At that time, there were well over 1 million registered Jews. And I specifically say registered because from that point on, people stopped registering in order to lower the quota, in order to say that we don't have it. And if you were an only child in your family, you did not have to, you could not be taken to be signed up. So all of a sudden, a family that had no children, all of a sudden gained a child because the next door neighbor had 2 children. One of their children now gets registered to them. It's my only child here. You can't take him away. There was a modicum of being generous, of being nice, of saying, you know what, of humanitarianism. If you've only got one child, we can't take them away. But at that point, in 1825, there were well over 1 million Jews registered in Russia, bearing in mind that most of these were brought in 1797. What happens in 1797? Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire falls apart, and Russia absorbs the majority of the Poland-Lithuanian Empire, and the pale of the settlement where the Jews had been living, Ukraine and all of Western Russia, that's where the majority of the Jews were living there, and that becomes the pale of the settlement. By the way, the expression going beyond the pale, if somebody did something naughty, that was a Jew who stepped. It comes from the origin, the pale of the settlement, that had gone beyond that. Pale actually is an old English word which means a stake, which would demarcate your boundary. So if you've gone beyond that, you've gone beyond the pale of the settlement. But there were 1 million Jews living there. So if you're going to have one for every 100 Jews, that means in the first year alone, they would have forcefully recruited 10,000 Jewish soldiers. Now, Russia was in no war at that time. It did not need these extra 10,000 Jewish soldiers. We're not very well known for our fighting prowess. I mean, that's what took the world by surprise in 1948, 56, 67, and 73. Now, we're the great big bully. But we weren't known to be fighters. From the time of the Maccabees in the first century BCE, we never had an army for nearly 2,000 years. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising was an anomaly. So taking Jews in the 1800s to fight was strange and unheard of. There was an exception, that the fighting Jew. Where was the exception of the fighting Jew? If we take the 17 and 1800s, there was the exception of the fighting Jew. Anyone? The pugilist. Yeah, the pugilist, as it was called then. The boxer, the fighting Jew, very much bare-knuckled fighting in London, which at that point was actually still illegal. And there was a famous Jewish boxer, which of course I'll show anybody. There was one famous one. Let's get up the guy here.
Not Lazarus, was it?
No, sorry.
Not
Who did
Lazarus.
you call it?
Lazarus, no.
No, Daniel Mendoza.
Mendoza.
Daniel Mendoza. Let's get him up over here. Here is the Star of Israel. He was only 5'7", and nobody actually really thought that he would actually be able to do anything. But the minute he has 37 fights, wins 34, knocks by a knockout in 30, only loses 3 times. Born in England, in London in 1764. So, but that is very much an exception to the rule. So for the Russians, the Tsarists, to take these Cantonists, they didn't need them at all. They were taken in order to actually be able to apostatize them. They wanted them to really be part of it. Just a second. Let me make sure we get the right one over here before we get to them. The boys. So Sharma writes here of, in 1835, a young nobleman by the name of Alexander Herzen is about to start serving a sentence of banishment in Vyatka, northeast Russia. And why? What was a crime? He'd attended a concert by the musician-composer Sokolsky, had said something against Tsar Nicholas I. And he sees the Jews being schlepped along, and he asks them, what's going on? These were young children, the ages of 8, 10. Legally, they couldn't be taken until they were 12. But they would take them from the ages of 8 and 10 years old and change the paper to say that these kids were 12. More than 50% of them died before they even got to where they were going to. By the time they were 18, the majority of them did not survive. And their usefulness to the army was negligible. It was mainly in order to be able to get them along, in order for them to apostatize. It doesn't really work, and as we'll see shortly, later on, they very much stopped this process because of it. And the one person, which was the third Lubavitch Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, who I mentioned, becomes the citizen of Russia, very much fights against it. He later on writes that if you spoke to a lot of the Jews that came to London in the 1860s and 1870s, they were running from the Chappers. The Chappers were actually the Jews because the worst things that the Russians did was said that the Jews were responsible to fill the quota of the children who were being taken to be the Cantonists. And of course, who's going to do it? The wealthy ones will buy themselves out of it. Those that gave less to the community, their children were taken. Now, I said the one person who really pushed against it was the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson. He was known by the Russians as the Tzaddik, the wonder man of Lubavitch. It was only in his days that they moved to. Before that, they weren't even called Lubavitchers; they were called Chabad. And he is seen as having influence over all of the Hasidic sects within Russia at that point. He very much fights against the Cantonists, and he sends emissaries to all of the far-flung places where the Cantonists were being taken, and tells his Jews, he says, set up as a peddler, buy an inn, become an innkeeper, keep a very low profile, but be there for the soldiers. And later on, he sets up a group called the Chevra Techias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead, in order to be able to take these soldiers. And he had a policy that didn't matter because if you're taken as a 10-year-old, then you were kept until you were 18. Then you had to serve in the army for 25 years. What sort of Judaism do you think these kids really remembered? Most of them wouldn't have even remembered that they were Jewish, but if they did, they knew they would go along to Lubavitch, that his door was open. You didn't need to knock nothing. And he said, these were the purest of pure souls. And he really worked hard. Because of that, he gets into a lot of trouble from the Russians. He gets arrested a number of times. but we've got a couple of minutes and I just want to have a look at the great conference that took place in 1843, when the Russians say, look, we've got to get the Jews on our side. And they set up a debate which was officially only supposed to last for 6 to 10 days. You know, they get it over and done with between 6 to 10 days. The Jews would agree with everything and don't worry. Why? Why did they think that would happen? Because they'd already shut down the printing presses. In 1834, the Gemara that you use now is called the Vilna Shas. It was printed by the brothers in Vilna in 1817 to 1822. They claimed that they had a 25-year copyright. Nobody was allowed to do it. Unfortunately, others in, which makes you get the right one. Who was it over here? Sorry? No, Slavita. Slavita want to do their own shas in 1834. And there's a whole bregas, and the government authority came along and they shut down all of the Jewish printing presses in between 1835 and 1838. All of the Jewish printing presses in Russia are shut down. Now, if you can't print your books, you can't educate your people, you can't put out your newspapers, your documents, your Pashkin villain, as they call them, you can't keep the community together. There's no email. Everything gets done by a proclamation hammered to the door. They'd learned very well from a certain reformer. If you want to tell everybody what to do, print it up, hammer it to the door of the church or to the shul, and everybody knows what to do. Shutting down those printing presses was a real death knell to the Jewish community. But in 1843, they say they set up a conference. There are four people, four dignitaries who are going to be the representatives of the Jewish community. Number one, you have the Tzemach Tzedek, Rabbi Nachum Mendel, the third Rebbe, representing all of the Hasidim, who, according to the official documents, was 75% of the Jews of Russia. It wasn't true. There's about 50%. You have Rabbi Yitzchak Volozhin, who we've mentioned already, the son of Reb Chaim, who set up the yeshiva system, representing the Misnagdim. You have Rabbi Yitzchak Halperin, representing the businessmen or the Polish Jews, and you have Bezalel Stern representing the Haskalah, the Enlightened movement. At the very beginning of the conference, they wanted the Tzaddik of Lubavitch to admit that a minhag is not important. You know, we can get rid of minhagim. Who cares what's happening over there? And so, and he said, no. They said, do you mean to tell us that the minhag of a woman covering her eyes before she lights Shabbos candles is important? He said, yes. They threw him into house arrest for the next 3 days. He wasn't allowed to speak to anyone. That was his introduction. He was asked later on by Rabbi Volozhin, saying to him, it doesn't say that. Why are you giving up your life for it? He said to him, he said, if I say yes, then that's the opening of the chink in the armor of Orthodox Judaism. First, they say that you're not allowed to cover your eyes when you light the candles. Then they say candles have got to be lit at a specific time, whether Shabbos has come in or it hasn't come in already. He says, and bit by bit, they'll chip away. If they kill me because of this, you can be certain of one thing. Not a single Jewish woman for the rest of history will ever dare not cover her eyes when it comes time to light the Shabbos candles. Yes, it may not be, apostasy. It may not be murder, but it's one of those mitzvahs. I've got to show that Judaism is authentic, and we will fight tooth and nail for it. Over the subsequent 16 weeks, it was supposed to last for 6 to 10 days. It starts on the 6th of May. It finishes on August the 27th. By the way, what calendar were they using at this point in Russia?
Julian calendar.
They were still using the Julian calendar. They haven't yet swapped over to the Gregorian calendar. So it's out by 11 days for the calendar that we use. But it lasts. And the Tsar wants it. He says, what's taking you so long? The Tzaddik of Lubavitch is refusing to give in to any one of our demands. And in fact, at one point, he even managed to gather together. They heard that in Petersburg, there was a whole representative of Cantonists who'd come along, and they asked for the Tzaddik of Lubavitch to come and speak to them. This is in 1843. The Cantonists have been done for 20 years already. and they go along and they polish their buttons and they speak to them. And the Rebbe goes along to speak to them, and he explains about emunah, about faith. He says, if you polish your buttons here with sand, the words of Tehillim, don't worry, you'll be all right. He gets thrown into prison for speaking to the Cantists and giving them encouragement. He gets thrown in prison again. He then goes back to the conference, and at the end of the conference, eventually, every single thing that the government wanted to change was gone. They agreed to every single one of the demands of the Jews. The only one that they weren't able to do was that in an area where there is no established Jewish school, then the government could set up theirs. So of course, what did the Jews do? They just quickly established schools in every single area. And up until 1930, up in the entire time, you've got past the communist revolution and beyond, even when by that point the communists were throwing the Jews into prison for setting up Jewish schools, until they leave just before the Second World War, there are Jewish schools in every area because of this, because the one rule that was kept in, that they managed to get through this conference, that if there is no Jewish school, we can set up our own Jewish school. And ironically, they then gave to their greatest opponent at the conference a title of honored citizen, which would allow him, this person also, one of the things was that his child would not need to become a Cantonist. It was never used anyway, but later on, when this was used, it came to a lot of good effect in subsequent generations, because this certificate was handed on child to child, and for the next 3 generations, none of his descendants were thrown into prison. The first 3 were thrown into prison by the Tsars over and over again for promoting Judaism. The sixth one was done also, but number 4 and 5 after this one were never thrown into prison because it was recognized that they were working for the good of Russian citizens. So even when it changed over into communists, that was when they said, oh well, if you got a certificate from the Tsars, it's no good. So from 1843 until 1917, the Tsars left the rabbis alone, because they'd seen when they fought in this debate that the Tsar had put together, they were fighting for the betterment of their citizens. And they were able to prove over and over, so much so that even Bezalel Stern, who had represented the Reform Haskalah, the Enlightenment movement, at the end of it, started keeping kosher, started keeping Shabbos, had a if not an Orthodox Jewish home, but at least a religious Jewish home in what he believed in. That takes us to the end of our hour. We've covered, I would say, probably the first half of it. Next week, we'll have a look more. Of course, next week, we have the beginning of Zionism. We're going to have the trial of Beilis. We're going to have Theodor Herzl. Ian, can you do me a favor? Zionism is not my forte, so don't have to be trying too much next week with your questions, because I've got a funny feeling you're going to trip me up time and time again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sheikh.
All the best.
Yeah, very good.
Good day, everybody.
Have a good day. Oh, wait a second. Next week, next week, Tuesday. Is that next week, Tuesday? We're not on. Sivir is back in Sheffield. So next week, we may have to do it for a week later. I'll see if I can do it another day. But next week, Tuesday, definitely is no history share. I'm out of town at the hospital all day.
Rabbi, you're still recording, aren't you?
Yes, I'm going to. So I'm just going to stop the recording now.